Today is Rat. Read Aloud Thursday.
Hi guys, this week we are continuing on with our book, Abraham Lincoln the Great Emancipator. The chapter we're going to start with this week is Thank Honey, and we're going to go ahead and get right into it. The miller came to the door of his mill. "Abe," he called, "your cornmeal is ready." He waited for a moment, but Abe didn't come. The miller called again, "Abe, Abe Lincoln, your cornmeal's ready." He waited again for a moment, but still Abe didn't come. The miller couldn't understand this. Abe often brought his father's corn to the mill, and he always waited until it was ground. Once he had to wait all day, but he hadn't complained and he hadn't gone home till the cornmeal was ready. No wonder the good miller was puzzled. He was just a bit angry, too. There were several men waiting to have their corn ground, and he must spend his time looking for Abe. The men were talking outside. Now they were coming up to the mill. They didn't like this delay either. No doubt they were all in a hurry. They always wanted to get home before dark. They were crossing a little footbridge close to the mill, and he could see their faces. To his great surprise, not one of them looked angry. In fact, all of them seemed worried. Their voices were anxious, too, when they spoke to him. "Abe isn't around here," said one. "I saw him go into the woods a long time ago." "So did I," said another. "His dog was with him." "I saw him, too," said another. "How long ago was that?" asked the miller. "Oh, it was an hour or so, I guess." "All of an hour," said the first man. "Then I'm afraid he's lost," said the miller. "He's only 7 years old." "Only 7?" said the third man. "Does he bring his father's corn to the mill?" "Yes," said the miller. "He rides a horse bareback with the corn in a sack behind him, and he pays me every penny and takes the cornmeal home." "My boy couldn't do that," said the fourth man, "and he's 8." "Abe is big for his age," said the second man. "He is too smart to be lost," said the first man, "and he knows the forest." "Yes, and he knows he ought to be back, too," said the miller. "Then something must have happened to him," said the second man. "Bears with cubs are ugly just now." "Wildcats and panthers are always ugly," said the first man. "We must hunt for him," said the miller. "Yes, yes," said the man. "Lead the way," said the miller to the first man. "You saw where he entered the woods." "Follow me," said the first man. In a single file they crossed the little footbridge and passed the great mill wheel. Then they went down the brook and through the clearing. They were now at the edge of the woods. "This is where he went in," said the first man. "Lead on," said the others. But just then something happened, something that made every one of those men stop in their tracks. A little dog came running out of the woods. "Honey!" cried the miller. "Honey!" cried the others. It was indeed Honey. He barked sharply. He leaped up to the miller's outstretched hand and touched it with his paw. His eyes were troubled and anxious. Everything he did and every sound of his bark said as plainly as words, "Abe's in trouble! Help!" Honey ran to the other men and looked up. He barked sharply again and again. Then he ran back into the woods. Suddenly he stopped and looked at the men again. And again he barked sharply. He was talking to them. He was saying, come on, follow me." "He wants us to follow him," said one man. "See how he turns and looks at us?" "Something has happened to Abe," said another man, "and Honey has come to tell us." "He'll lead us to Abe," said another man. "Come on." The men followed Honey. He led them far into the woods. At last he stopped at a cave. He looked at the men and barked. Then he ran into the cave. The men followed Honey. The cave was not very light, and at first they had trouble seeing where they were going. As soon as their eyes were used to the dark, they could walk faster. Soon they heard a boy's voice calling, "Help! Help!" "That sounds like Abe," said the miller. "I know his voice." "We're coming, Abe! We're coming!" shouted the men. Very soon they found him. He could talk, but he couldn't move. He was held fast between two great rocks. "Why, Abe," said the miller, what's happened here?" "I climbed up on this rock," said Abe. "Then all at once that large rock fell. I was caught between them and I couldn't move." "The rock might have fallen on you," said one man. The men worked carefully. Slowly they rolled the rock away, and at last Abe was free. He thanked the men for saving him. "Don't thank us," they said. "Thank your dog, Honey." Then Honey barked and barked. That was his way of saying, "I brought these men here. I told them about you." The men laughed at Honey and patted him. Abe patted him too, but he didn't laugh. "My goodness," he cried. "What if that rock had fallen on Honey?" The next chapter, the new home in Indiana. The two tired horses came slowly along the road. One was pretty dark-eyed, Miss Nancy Lincoln. In front of her rode Sarah. Abe rode the other horse, with a great bundle of household goods tied behind him. Mr. Lincoln walked beside the horses. All day long they had traveled, and the day before that too. "When will we come to the big wide river?" said Sarah. "I thought we would make it by evening," said Mr. Lincoln, "but we can't. The horses are too tired. We'll camp in a good place first." And here it is, a spring by the side of the road. This is good luck. Whoa, whoa. In another minute everyone was busy. Mr. Lincoln fed and watered the horses. Then he gathered wood and made a fire. Miss Lincoln fried bacon and corn cakes. Abe gathered leaves and made beds on the ground. Sarah took coverlets from the great bundle and laid them on leaves. By that time supper was ready, and the Lincoln family sat on a log and ate. Oh, how good the bacon and corn cakes are! Oh, how cool the sparkling spring water was! They talked about the home they had left on Knob Creek. They were all sorry to leave it. "But our new home will be prettier," said Mother. "Our cabin will be on a little hill." "Children," said Father, "there are walnut and hickory trees all over the place." "I love walnuts," said Sarah. "So do I," said Abe, "and I love hickory nuts too, but I'm sorry I have to leave Austin." "Austin can visit us," said Mother, "and best of all," said Father, "corn grows better in Indiana, so I'll make more money than I did in Kentucky." "Oh, I'm sure you will, Thomas," said Mother. "And now, children, it's time for bed." "Will you keep the fire burning all night?" asked Sarah. "Yes, indeed," said Father. "There are many wild animals in these woods." "May I help watch?" asked Abe. "I may call you later. I'll watch first." The others got ready for bed. It took only a moment. They just rolled up on their covers and clothes, and soon were fast asleep. Suddenly Abe heard his father call him. It was his turn to watch, so he jumped out of his covers and went to the fire. "Why, this isn't any fire at all," he said. Then he piled on wood until he had it blazing. "No beast will come near this fire," he said. "They can see it far away." Then he piled on more wood and kept the fire blazing for a long time. Suddenly he noticed that the fire was going out. He looked for wood, but there was no more. He was frightened. What shall I do?" he thought. He didn't dare go into the dark forest for wood. The blaze went out. The fire was only smoking now. All around was a wall of darkness, black, black darkness. And now in his wall of black, Abe saw two green spots of light, the eyes of some wild animal. They were coming toward him. Nearer and nearer they came. "Father!" he called. "Father! Father! Wake up! Wake up!" Abe opened his eyes and sat up. It was daylight. The fire was burning. Bacon and corn cakes were frying. "Why, I thought I let the fire go out," said Abe. "I saw two green eyes watching me." "You had a bad dream," said Mother. "Didn't I watch the fire at all?" "No," said Father. "Your mother and I did." "I'm glad it was a dream," said Abe. "But I learned how to keep a fire burning all night." "How?" Father asked. "A low fire. No blaze. Just a little wood at a time." "The boy learns in his sleep," said Father. They all laughed. Then Abe crawled out of his covers, and Sarah crawled out of hers. They washed at the spring and combed their hair. Then they were ready for breakfast. Again the Lincoln family sat along the log and ate bacon and corn cakes. Then on they went together toward the beautiful Ohio River. A ferry boat took the Lincolns, horses and all, across the Ohio River. When they reached the other shore, they were in Indiana, but they were still far from their new home. Mr. Lincoln hired a big wagon and hitched up his horses. The others threw the bundles in and sat on them. Then off they drove into the wilderness. Miss Lincoln and the children had never seen such a dense forest. There was no end to it. They had to travel slowly, for the road wasn't much more than a path. At times Mr. Lincoln had to cut away tree branches so the wagon could pass on. Of course Abe helped. He knew how to handle an axe because he had helped his father in Kentucky. The trail was very rough. Sometimes the wagon bumped over big roots. Then the whole family would bounce into the air. But that didn't worry the Lincolns. The more they bounced, the more they laughed. "It's fun to bounce," said Abe. "I like it." "So do I," said Sarah. Now a wide creek had to be crossed. The children watched the water creeping up closer and closer to the wagon bed and were frightened. Mother didn't seem to like it either. "Thomas," she called, "the water will come into the wagon." "Oh, that won't hurt anything," said Mr. Lincoln. "We can dry everything in the sun." "Why, of course we can," said Mother. "I didn't think of that." "And your feet won't melt if the water does cover them," said Father. "You're neither sugar nor salt." "That's true," said Mother. "We'll just play we are wading in the creek, children." What fun those two children had then. The water did not come into the wagon up to their ankles, and they could wade sitting still. After that they were eager to cross creeks, so on they went, farther and farther into the great wilderness. On they went, bumping and bouncing and wading and laughing. At last they reached Mr. Lincoln's land. There was no clearing, no cabin, no shelter of any kind. There was nothing but dense, dense forest. The children had no time to be afraid of the Indians or wild animals. They had to go to work at once. Mr. Lincoln and Abe cut down small trees and made a shed with poles. It wasn't much of a home, but at least it was a shelter from rain and snow. Then came a new log cabin. Large trees had to be chopped down and made into logs. The logs had to be cut certain lengths. Large stumps had to be pulled or burned. It was all hard work, and the weather was cold and wet. All winter long, on every clear day, Abe worked with his father. Miss Lincoln and Sarah had to find the food. Miss Lincoln could shoot almost as well as Mr. Lincoln. Sometimes she shot a deer. Sometimes she came back with squirrels or other rabbits. The front of the shed had to be left open, and in this opening the Lincolns had their fire. And here they did their cooking. At last the cabin was almost finished. The floor was laid and the windows and doors weren't made, but the Lincolns moved in anyway. It was better than a shed. Mother said they could get along for a while until Father had finished clearing land for a cornfield. Mother liked the new cabin because it was such a beautiful place. It stood on a slight elevation in the midst of large forest trees. It was shaded by walnut and hickory trees. Nearby were pawpaw and sassafras trees. There were wild grapevines and spice bushes of many kinds and wild berries. All this delighted Miss Lincoln. "Thomas," she said, "you have chosen a beautiful spot for our home." She hung a bearskin over the open doorway and spread deerskins on the dirt floor. In the evening, after the day's work was done, the Lincoln family sat before a blazing fire in the large fireplace. Sometimes Sarah and Abe ate walnuts or hickory nuts. Sometimes they just sat still and listened to Father's stories until Mother said, "Time for bed, children." Then up the pegs in the wall went Abe. He slept in the loft on a pile of sweet-smelling leaves, covered with a thick wool cover. He had no pillow, but he had a bearskin over him, and he was warm and happy. All of the Lincolns were happy together. The cabin was a dear place to them. It was their home, and they loved it. Miss Lincoln liked the new home in Indiana, except for one thing. There was no school in the Pigeon Creek settlement, and Nancy Lincoln wanted her children to go to school. She had gone to school herself when she was a girl, and she could read and write. She had learned to love good books, and she wanted Sarah and Abe to love them too. But what could she do? There wasn't a school within 10 miles. "Well," she said, "we will have a school here at home, and I will be the schoolmaster." The children hadn't gone to school in Kentucky very long, and they hadn't forgotten all they had learned, so Miss Lincoln began with their letters. Then she taught them spelling and reading and a little arithmetic. She told them Bible stories and read the Bible to them. She taught them to be honest. She taught them good manners. Abe learned to take off his coonskin cap when he entered a cabin. He learned to stand until older persons were seated. Both children learned to say thank you, good morning, and good night. Indeed, Sarah and Abe had such good manners that later on other settlers liked to have their children visit the Lincolns. The school went on. Miss Lincoln gave the children as much time as she could, but she was too busy to give them as much time as they really needed. But she found out several things. She found that while both children were smart and learned quickly, Abe was the one who really loved to study. So she made her mind up to one thing. Abe should go to school. Mr. Lincoln didn't agree with her. He had never gone to school himself, and he couldn't read or write. "You've taught Abe to read and write," he said. "That's enough for any boy who is going to work in the fields all his life." "No, Thomas, it isn't enough. Abe is not like other boys. He is more serious, and he asks smart questions about things. He asks too many questions. I tell him to get to work." "Because you can't answer him, and neither can I," said Miss Lincoln. "And that's just the reason he should have a real teacher, someone who can tell him what he wants to know." "Well, there isn't a school near enough, Nancy, so that settles it." "No, Thomas, it doesn't. There is a way. We'll move near a school." "And begin all over again? Build a new cabin and clear new land?" "Yes," said that determined young mother. "We'll begin all over again." Just then Abe came into the cabin. "Abe," said Mother, "we are talking about sending you to school." "You don't want to go, do you?" asked Father. "You'd rather work in the field all day, wouldn't you?" "No," said Abe. "I'd rather go to school and work with books." "Abe, you shall go to school next winter if I live," said Nancy Lincoln. But Nancy Lincoln didn't live. She died in the fall of 1818. And that is the end of our chapters for today. Make sure that you go down into the description box and see those questions and see what you remembered from today's reading. And we will pick up next week with our next 2 chapters. So I'll see you then.